Sunday afternoon, we'll have our final men's meeting of the year. And one of the things we're going to talk about is Christmas Day falls on a Wednesday this year. And there is discussion if we want to move our midweek Bible study to Thursday night, just that week. And so that Wednesday, for members that are out of town visiting, family and so forth, don't feel compelled to come back right away. So if you're not part of that men's meeting and you have opinion one way or another and you'd like to have that opinion heard, just let me know. And I'll be happy to share that with the men as we talk about that. Yay or nay. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about a situation, at least one of the lessons we're going to bring out is a situation that is very sad, but sometimes is a reality. And that is a situation where there could be a Christian man or a Christian woman, we're going to use the man as an example, who is very useful at the church. He teaches Bible class, he takes the lead in worship service, doing various things. He might even do a lesson from time to time. He knows all the right things to say, he knows how to act as a Christian among his brethren, but at home it's quite a different story. At home, he is very much like the world. He does not fight against sin. He is not trying to be like Christ. He lives a life he would call a hypocritical life. And my question to you would be, how would you think God would deal with such a person? Would you think, would providentially and quickly remove that man from his duties at church, doing it in God's way? Would God send evil upon him to punish him for his hypocrisy? That's kind of going to be one of the lessons we talk about. How does God see priests? As Christians are priests that aren't fulfilling their true duty, but are, in a certain capacity, being profitable to God. And so we're going to get back into our lesson series on the priesthood of God, which if we entitle Good and Bad and Not, you're going to see why we've entitled it that. But as we enter into our series at this point, we have tried the best we can chronologically tracing all the way from the high priest of Aaron through the history of the Old Testament. And so now we are actually getting to that period where the priesthood then now moves into captivity, okay? And when you think about the priests being taken captive back to Babylon, it appears that the priests don't just disappear, they continue to exist. It appears that they continue to serve the people and to serve God in some capacity. We don't know to what extent. But one thing that we're sure of is that the work of the priesthood diminishes considerably. And why is that? Well, first and foremost, they're taken away from the temple. There's no temple, obviously, in Babylon. And secondly, eventually, during those years of captivity, the temple and Jerusalem are destroyed. And so there are some things that they could do before in Jerusalem at the temple that they still can do, like teaching the people and judging the people according to the law and being mediators for the people in some regard. But obviously, leading a temple worship with the songs and with the sacrifices and keeping the feast days and all of that centered around Jerusalem, the temple, it's gone. And that is no more. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the priesthood during the days of captivity. Turn with me, if you would, to 1 Chronicles, the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 6. The book of Chronicles starts off kind of like the book of Numbers, a whole lot of genealogies, a whole lot of family trees. And 1 Chronicles chapter 6 is dedicated to the family tree and a few different genealogies within the tribe of Levi. And so if you look at verse 1 all the way to verse 15, you have what appears to be the lineage of the high priesthood, starting with Aaron and tracing through Aaron all the way to the priest during the destruction of Jerusalem. And there it ends. And then there's some other family trees that are within the tribe of Levi. Talk about the cities that are given to the tribes of Levi and so forth. But we want to talk about these priests that are mentioned specifically in verse 13, 14, and verse 15. And so in verse 13 it says, "And Shallum became the father of Hilkiah, and Hilkiah became the father of Azariah." And so one of the things we've been trying to do here is give a list of these high priests in succession. And you might remember the last high priest that we talked about was Hilkiah. He is the last, as far as it's recorded, as far as the story is told, as far as we can determine, was the last good high priest up to those days of captivity. He served under Josiah. Remember, it's in his days that they found the book of the law and allowed Josiah to even increase greater restoration of the old law, the temple worship, and all of that. And so Josiah and Hilkiah worked together in taking away all the idols and restoring that temple worship and restoring covenant with God. Well, eventually Hilkiah dies, eventually Josiah dies, and there are only 4 kings that now reign in Judah up to the end, from Josiah to the end. And 2 of those 4 kings their reign lasts only 3 months. And so we're getting very close to the end. And so as we look at Hilkiah, we move to, as verse 13 says, his son takes over, Azariah the 4th, but we don't know when he started. We don't know when he ended. This is the only mention of Azariah, the high priest, and so there's just nothing we know about him. And so we're just going to skip over Azariah. And then Azariah's son, Sariah, becomes high priest. Look, if you would, at verse 14. "And Azariah became the father of Sariah, and Sariah became the father of Jehozadak." And so Sariah becomes the high priest, and we know that he is high priest. We don't know when he started, but he's high priest during the days of that last king of Judah, King Zedekiah. And as you'll notice by that little asterisk there, we do know when Sariah's life comes to an end, when his high priest ends, and that is during the destruction of Jerusalem. The Bible tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, as he takes over Jerusalem, gathers the high priest, some of the officials, brings them out, and he kills them. And that's the end of Sariah. But you'll notice also in verse 14 that his son, Jehozadak, he survives. And he then becomes the high priest. He is taken into captivity. Look, if you would, at verse 15. "And Jehozadak went along when the Lord carried Judah and Jerusalem away into exile by Nebuchadnezzar." Now, exactly what Jehozadak does as high priest, we don't know. It's not recorded. How active he was as a high priest, we don't know. But he's the high priest during captivity until, again, some point he dies in captivity. And then his son, Jeshua, sometimes shown in the Bible as Joshua, becomes high priest. And he'll He'll be high priest the remainder of captivity. And he is the high priest that returns with the captives when Cyrus says, go back and build Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. It is Jeshua that is the high priest. And so, in essence, that's your high priesthood from Hilkiah all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem, all through captivity, and then to the return. We will talk about Jeshua in our next lesson. But we want to focus on this period of the priesthood during captivity. And so as we look at Sariah, we're going to start with Sariah. We're going to label him the bad, not a good high priest. And how do we know that? Well, one of the interesting, we kind of use this as kind of a Bible study first and foremost. Then we're going to draw some lessons out of it. Sariah in the book of Chronicles is referred to as a chief priest. And this is something that Chronicles does. Kings calls them high priest. Chronicles calls them chief priest. It's not quite the same that we see in the New Testament where there were several chief priests. Okay? But the Chronicles uses the term chief priest except once. And that one time in Chronicles is Hilkiah, where he's called a high priest. All the other times they're called chief priests. And so if you see that, just know that in Chronicles that's referring to the high priest. Well, Sariah, we says, is the bad because he is the high priest during the days of the last king, maybe the second to last king, maybe the third to last king. All of those kings after Josiah are spoken of as being evil against God, leading the people into idolatry. And so Sariah becomes one of these bad priests that we've seen, and we've talked about lessons about these bad priests that don't stand up when the king of Judah, who himself is supposed to be a spiritual leader but decides not to be. Well, when that happens, the only hope God has is a high priest. That he will stand up and say, no, we're not doing that. Or try to teach the people and persuade the people to be faithful to God and His covenant. But in a lot of cases, the high priest was not like that. And Sariah doesn't stand up, it appears. And he just goes along with the idolatry. And he goes along, which eventually ends with the captivity of Judah, the destruction of Jerusalem, and as we just talked about, his own demise as Nebuchadnezzar has him killed. But there are other priests, good priests, that we've seen when kings are evil, that they do stand up. You might remember the time where King Uzziah, went into the temple to do the thing that only the priests are allowed to do. And the high priest took along 80 priests with him, went into the temple and withstood the king. That's not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of people that won't stand up to evil leadership today. But there have been good priests to do that. And our question would be, what kind of priest are we going to be when we're faced with a situation like that? Will we be like Sariah and just kind of go with the flow? Or will we be like one of those good high priests that will stand for the Lord? Turn with me, if you would, to 2 Chronicles and verse 36. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And we're going to look at verse 14. Basically, what Chronicles is doing here in this last chapter, it's talking about the end of Jerusalem. It's talking about the evil king Zedekiah and all the things he did against God. But in verse 14, not only does it talk about Zedekiah and how he turned from God, but look at, furthermore, all the officials of the priests and the people were very unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they defiled the house of the Lord, which he had sanctified in Jerusalem. When will the Lord's church come to an end? Well, the Bible says never. It'll never come to an end. It'll never be demolished. But there are some of the Lord's congregations that will come to an end. And one of the reasons sometimes they come to an end is when God's priests, like these priests, go along with the world and buy into the ideology of the world and don't stand strong against it. And so Sariah appears to be among that list of priests who, like Zedekiah, turned away from God. And so as a result, you can look at 2 Kings 25, 18, 20, 21. And as we talked about, he's killed by Nebuchadnezzar. So what about the priests during captivity? What about Jehozadak and the other priests? Well, I have a question mark there because we don't know. We turn to the books of captivity, in which in the Old Testament there's only two that really talk about captivity. Jeremiah overlaps a little bit, but he's more about what's going on in Jerusalem at that time. And so we turn to Ezekiel and we turn to Daniel, which records the history of captivity. Well, Daniel does not mention the priest at all. He's more of the prophet to the royalty, to Nebuchadnezzar and the kings of Babylon. But when you talk about Ezekiel, he does talk about the priest, but he doesn't really talk about the priest during captivity. He's talking about the priests that are before captivity, the priests that have led to captivity. And so we have a question mark there. But let's take a look at some of the things that Ezekiel says about the priesthood. And what you're going to see is that, how was the priesthood? It was good. And it was bad. Good and bad. And so as I mentioned, Jehozadak becomes high priest, but we don't know anything of that other than that fact. So we ask the question, what kind of priests were there at this time? Well, let's take a look at Ezekiel 22, where Ezekiel describes why Judah fell, why they came to this demise. And basically what he tells us is every part of Judah fell away from God, its king, its people, its princes, and its prophets, and its priests. So look, if you would, at verse 26. Among those at fault, he says, her priests have done violence to my law and have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the profane. And they have not taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they hide their eyes from my Sabbaths. And I am profaned among them. I want you to notice the fault that God, through Ezekiel, highlights here. What was the big fault that he talks about? He says, my priest did not make a distinction between what is holy and what is not, between what is clean and what is unclean. I want you to think about that as we get into now our application part of this lesson. First and foremost, if anyone is responsible for making a distinction between clean and unclean, it was the priest's job. When you go back to the book of Leviticus, the priestly book, and you really look at that book, what you see, especially from the middle to the end of that book, it's all about that which is clean versus that which is unclean. That which defiles versus that which does not defile. Over and over in that book of Leviticus, one of the things that God is getting across is, priest, it's your job to make sure that Israel stands up above and is a holy nation. That people from all other nations can see this is the way it's supposed to be. This is a nation that God blesses. This is a nation that God created. This is the way that you were supposed to turn out. But the only way they could do that is if they made that distinction where the rest of the world didn't. And boy, I tell you, does that not have application in our world today? We constantly are seeing in our society people that says what God considers to be unclean, oh, that's clean. That's normal. That's okay. There's older members in this congregation here tonight, I'm telling you, who if you asked them 50 years ago, if they would believe that what's going on in America as far as moral views, they would say, I would not believe that we are where we are today. I wouldn't believe it 50 years ago. There are churches claiming to be Christians who don't make a distinction. At least not the distinction God makes. Not a firm distinction between that which is holy versus that which is unholy. It's becoming harder and harder for the priesthood of God to make that stand. But I'll tell you what, we don't want to be like the bad priest. If we don't do it, who's going to do it? The government? The schools? It's our job to make that distinction. And we can clearly see when God's priests don't, what happens? It doesn't have a good ending. But you know what? During captivity, there were also some good priests. Go to chapter 1. What about the prophet Ezekiel? Look, if you would, at verse 3. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 3. The word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel. You see it? The priest, the son of Buzai, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kebar. And there the hand of the Lord came upon him. And so God chooses a prophet of captivity. And it's Ezekiel. Ezekiel's other job was a priest. He was a priest. And I can't imagine God would choose a bad priest to be his prophet. So there had to be good priests, faithful priests, priests that were not going along with all of this idolatry, that were trying to influence people. And Ezekiel appears to be one such priest. But as we come to a close tonight, look, if you would, at Ezekiel 44, and this will be where we close. In Ezekiel 44, God, through Ezekiel, talks about the priesthood again. And let me just kind of set this up. Beginning in chapter 40, you have kind of this interesting thing in Ezekiel. Going back to the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, it starts off with a series of visions that God shows Ezekiel. And basically, in a nutshell, what he sees is the temple in Jerusalem, God's chariot coming down, God leaving the temple and saying, goodbye, I'm not dwelling here anymore. Because of the sin of the people, God leaves Israel. He leaves his dwelling place. At the end of the book, in these 40 chapters, 41, 42, God shows another vision where in essence he makes a new temple and a new layout for Jerusalem and new tribal territories. Now, this is not to be taken literally. This isn't literally going to happen, but he's talking about in an apocalyptic way, in a symbolic way, that when the church comes, it's not going to be like it was in the old temple, the old days. It's not going to be filled with corruption. And so the priests aren't scattered among the people. The priests are right there. They're living at the temple. They're close to God. And they are godly. They are holy priesthood. But all of them? Well, look if you would at Ezekiel 44, verse 10, beginning. Here God through Ezekiel says these words. But the Levites who went far from me when Israel went astray, who went astray from me after their idols, shall bear the punishment for their iniquity. Yet they shall be ministers in my sanctuary, having oversight at the gates of the house, and ministering in the house. They shall slaughter the burnt offering, and the sacrifice for the people. And they shall stand before them to minister to them, because they ministered to them before their idols, and became a stumbling block of iniquity to the house of Israel. Therefore I have sworn against them, declares the Lord God, that they shall bear the punishment of their iniquity. And they shall not come near to me to serve as a priest to me, nor come near to any of my holy things, to the things that are most holy. But they will bear their shame and their abominations which they have committed. Yet I will appoint them to keep charge of the house, of all its service, of all that shall be done in it. So how were the priests? Well, some were bad priests. Some were serving the Lord at the temple. But away from the temple, they lived like the world. They served the idols. They broke covenant with God. They didn't try to live a godly life. So let's go back to the beginning of our lesson. How will God deal with a Christian like that? Who's serving the Lord, who seems to have some profit, but his life is not really dedicated to the Lord outside his brethren. Well, it appears here, God says, listen, they're going to bear their punishment. They're going to bear their shame. But God may not remove them right away. God might use the good that they do for the good it is. And that's one of the amazing things about the Bible, is that God can use the evil of people to complete His will. And He can use the good of sinful people for the good that it is. But just because God is working through you and using you, and that there's some profit that you are delivering, that does not mean that you have complete favor with God. God did that with several nations. He used their power, He used their strength to bring punishment upon His people for their sins. But in the end, He punished those nations for their iniquity. Yes, He gave them strength. Yes, He gave them power. Yes, He gave them victory at the time. But He said, sin is still sin. And so, if there was a Christian like that, deceiving himself and thinking, well, this is an easier way to be Christian, to say all the right things and to do all the right things, but then to live the life I want, let me just say to you, in the end, it's not going to work out good. It's going to be like Sariah. It's going to be like these priests who didn't make a distinction. And that being the case, why don't you make a change? And be like the priest that he talks about in verse 15. But the Levitical priests, the sons of Zadok, who kept charge of my sanctuary, when the sons of Israel went astray from me. They shall come near to me to minister to me. They shall stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood, declares the Lord. They shall enter my sanctuary. They shall come near to my table to minister to me and to keep my charge. It shall be that when they enter the gates of the inner court, they shall be clothed with linen garments, and wool shall not be on them while they are ministering in the gates of the inner court and in the house. And he goes on to talk about all the things that they'll be. But I want you to notice this distinction. There is good priests. There were good priests. That when everyone else went astray, they served the Lord. They ministered strong to the Lord. They did not bow the knee to Baal. And so what does God say? They're going to serve me. But not only are they going to serve me, I'm going to bring them close to me. They're going to be near me. Did you see that? The other priests will serve, but there's going to be some distance. They're not going to come to the holy things. So if it's going to be that way, why not be like one of these good priests? Why not be sincere and not only say the right things, but mean the right things? And not just do the right things, but mean with a sincere heart, dedicated to the Lord. A priest that makes that distinction, even if you're the only one making the distinction between what God says is holy and what is unclean. There's some great lessons that come from these words about the priesthood in the days of captivity. But ultimately, he says, there's going to be a day of judgment in which the priests are going to be judged. God will still use bad priests, hypocritical priests, corrupt priests, for the good that they do. But in the end, they'll be rejected. God will bring near the good priests. They will be rewarded. So why would we want to do what's easy? 1 Peter chapter 3, and we'll bring the lesson to a close. 1 Peter chapter 3. We are God's priests today. We offer sacrifices. We serve Him spiritually. And I want you to just look at these words in 1 Peter. Did I put chapter 3? I meant chapter 2. Sorry about that. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. And just let these words fall on your heart. As a priest, as one of God's chosen, as part of His holy nation yet today. Peter writes, but you are not just a race, you are a chosen race. Not just a priesthood, you are a royal priesthood. You're not just a nation, you are a holy nation. You're not just a people, you're a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. You see, he says that you are all these wonderful, blessed things, but because of that, you're called to action. You're called to make a distinction between what is holy and what is not. Not just in your words, but with your life as well. And so it's your choice as to what kind of priest you want to be. if we can help you to be the best priest, to be that priest of God, to be close, to come near as he described through Ezekiel, to serve him in that closeness, to approach the holy things. Won't you let that be known tonight as together we stand and as we sing.